Thank you all so much for joining us for this final installment of the year of functions.nyc, which is a series of conversations brought to you by Tech NYC on exactly that, how NYC functions. To those of you who are new to us, Tech NYC is a nonprofit organization representing the tech and startup communities here in New York. We are a membership-based organization, now more than 800 member companies strong, of all sizes and across all 5 boroughs. And we are really working with that community to, number one, ensure that the innovation economy thrives in New York City. And number two, ensure that New York City remains the best place to build and grow a tech company. One of the ways we feel it's really important to do that is to ensure that tech is well connected and well integrated into the larger fabric of the city. So we really work with our member companies to get involved in issues ranging from mass transit to public education to affordable housing, all issues that we have discussed in previous editions of this series. And so today we are really excited to have this session on climate and sustainability with our 2 sort of guest speakers and leaders in this area, Daniel Zarrilli and Donnel Baird. Just by way of quick introduction of both of those guys, Dan Zarrilli is New York City's Chief Climate Policy Officer and the Director of OneNYC, which is the city's long-term strategic plan to combat the climate crisis. And we'll hear a lot about that, I'm sure, in the next hour. Before joining the mayor's office as the Chief Climate Policy Advisor, he spent some time as the Senior Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Donnel Baird is the founder and CEO of Blocpower, a startup that markets, finances, and installs solar and energy efficiency technology for nonprofits, small businesses, multifamily projects, all kinds of other areas to help slash their energy costs. He's a community organizer in Brooklyn, spent a year doing voter contact stuff for the Obama campaign, also managed a national campaign to leverage the Department of Energy financing rules to create some green construction jobs for out-of-work populations, something that I think he can also talk about a lot here and will be really generative to the conversation. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to turn things over now to Dan and Donnel.
Thanks. Thanks, Tyler. Dan, good to see you. I hope that you've navigated this difficult year throughout the pandemic, that you and your team are well and you and your family are well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Same to you. Yeah, I've been partly navigating, of course, from where I'm sitting now, which is my kid's bedroom in my makeshift office for the last couple months. But yeah, our team is still, of course, working remotely, but continuing to move important things forward. And, this has been a really it's been a wild year in New York City for lots of different reasons, and that we're all living through and we all know very well. But it's also a poignant moment to think about the kind of disruptions that are coming with our climate crisis and sort of the dry run that we're experiencing now. And hopefully we're learning some things from this that can make the looming climate crisis and all the disruptions it's going to cause, that we navigate that better for sure.
How are you thinking about that? Let's jump into it. I mean, I do think this has been an object lesson for, hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people around the world, around the kinds of disruptions and dislocations that we can all expect. And New York City is, of course, the epicenter. I mean, what lessons are you as a leader on climate in the city government taking away? And what are you asking your colleagues in the city council and in City Hall to think about in terms of what we're learning from now and how to prevent this from being the steady state, moving forward because of climate disaster?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that it's fully crystallized yet, but,
Sure.
Knowing that what we're going through now is, it's not just public health disruption, it's economic disruption, there's social disruption. It's sort of like it isn't very much a dry run for what's coming from different things, whether it's, more heat events and sea level rise and food insecurity and, is going to cause those same kind of disruptions going forward. And I think, the reactions to it are also in some ways worrying, the sort of the fighting over, whether or not to believe the science and the disinformation and the political disruption. has all been, I think, a part of this story as well. But we know, just maybe to take it back to what we know, climate change is going to cause massive disruptions, whether it's sort of the physical things that are coming and the storms and the sea level rise and heat and, all of that. But more worrying to me is the social disruption that comes from all that, the food insecurity, the migration, the conflict, the public health threats. And yes, we're going to see more public health threats if we don't get ourselves in better balance with nature, all over the globe. And that plays itself out in just very unique ways in cities, because that's where the people are, that's where the economic activity is. And we need to find ways to come together to really tackle these major things together. And the OneNYC program that we put out, our city strategic plan that I know we were going to talk about, is not just a climate plan. It's about putting climate in the context of the challenges we face as a city. Certainly our climate crisis at the forefront of that, but the health and wealth inequities that we face in our city, largely driven by race, the threats to our democracy. Those are the kind of things that we were talking about in OneNYC even before the pandemic. And, a lot of that is exactly what's, what we're facing right now. And so, doubling down on, understanding those challenges, doubling down on the things that the city's doing to bring more people into our democratic and civic life, doing everything we can to get at the root causes of our inequalities, and making climate something that we don't just think about off to the side as like one other problem, but it's core to our understanding of all the problems that we face. And that's why I liked how Tyler was talking about technology as being something that we need to think about in terms of affordable housing or public health or a range of issues that we face. I think climate is very much a similar issue that we need to put a climate lens on all the decisions we make. We need to put a justice lens on all the decisions we make. And I think that will help us all come out of this moment, much stronger and more prepared for the kinds of disruptions that are coming over the horizon at us.
Great. Why don't we spend a minute before we spend some more time on OneNYC and the role of technologists in OneNYC? Why don't we talk a little bit about your background, if you don't mind? You've been an engineer. You've worked at the Economic Development Corporation, NYC EDC, which is responsible for economic development across the city. And now you help to run the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. Talk a little bit about your role and how the fact that you have been trained as an engineer and approach the world from that technical perspective, how has that informed your approach to all of this?
Yeah, it's been in some ways it's felt like both a windy road but also somewhat of a natural progression from where I started my career, which is as an engineer. I'm a civil engineer. I worked on lots of big infrastructure programs around the city, like JFK AirTrain and Jamaica Station and things like that. But I moved over into the public sector because I knew that's the place where decisions are made. I was more aligned with wanting to understand the social dimensions of how infrastructure can support the city. And I had an opportunity to join the Economic Development Corporation, helping to run their real estate portfolio and to maintain and upgrade it. And it happened to be a lot of waterfront assets. I was ultimately running the city's cruise terminals and ferry landings and heliports and the food distribution center up in Hunts Point. A lot of it was a pretty diverse real estate portfolio. But of course, a lot of it was on the waterfront, and a lot of it got beat up pretty badly by Hurricane Sandy, which was my pivot point into really coming into the climate space, and have really spent now the last over 8 years working on issues of resilience, of sustainability, climate policy, fossil fuel divestment, a whole range of things. That Hurricane Sandy for me was the major pivot point. And I guess to answer your question around sort of how I approach things, I think my training as an engineer, engineers are natural problem solvers. We think about how to break big problems down into smaller problems and tackle them one at a time, but having an understanding of what the bigger picture is for all that. And I think that's how I've tried to approach these things. And that's how, when I was asked to take on the program of writing the city's strategic plan, that OneNYC document, it's a pretty, it can be wide ranging and can feel a little unwieldy sometimes to think about all the different threats we face as a city. But I think that sort of engineering problem solving of, let's break things down into their natural parts, let's really understand them, and then let's build it back up again into a coherent whole. That's, I think, natural problem solving that comes from the engineering education in the background, but now applied in a very different sort of policy space.
Great. And what about how you think of the role of the mayor's office of sustainability, its relationship to the city council, how you guys think about navigating those kind of, like, what are the fine lines or boundaries between the roles and responsibilities of the executive function, the city council, with regard to addressing climate?
Yeah, I think in all areas of our climate policy, there are some natural things that we can do as the executive with the mayor, that the mayor can do through setting budgets and running the agencies and taking action and making investments that are really powerful. We have a strong mayor system, of course, here in New York City that allows us to take direct action. But locking certain things in for the long term, of course, the legislative power that the city council has is really important here. And they've been a great partner over the last several years and really, helping us. Let's use buildings as an example, and the work that the Sustainability Office does to really take leadership on building retrofits and building codes and things like that. By leveraging the power of codes and standards, we can lock in better ways of doing things. We can lock in lower energy use for how we build things, and the most recent work on Local Law 97 to upgrade the standards for all existing buildings, which is a really world-leading move. A lot of people, when we talk about buildings, you naturally think about, well, let's upgrade the building codes, and that'll take care of all the new construction. But we know that something like 90% of the buildings that exist today are still going to exist in 2050. And so that means we need to get at the heart of those buildings and really retrofitting them for better energy use. And that's something that the city council has been such a great partner on. And, in particular, the leadership of council member Constantinides in advancing that legislation, working with the advocates, working with the expertise that exists in the mayor's office to make sure that those that legislation is implementable, and we can work with the real estate industry to make it happen. I think they've been a great partner in all this, and whenever there's good ideas, we're always talking to the council about how to implement those ideas, how to move them forward. And then there's plenty of things that we also can do naturally, just as the executive, when it comes to investment on, say, city municipal buildings or the city's own fleet of vehicles, our own energy purchases. There's a lot of things we can do directly to influence how the city operates that helps, one, set the marketplace for clean energy, for resilient infrastructure, for environmental justice initiatives, that also has a long life as well, and has a big impact on how the city operates.
Great. Great. And so we know that, in California, there's lots of cities that have banned gas usage in new buildings. New York City has chosen to dramatically reduce fossil fuels in existing buildings. We know that existing buildings provide, 68% of greenhouse gas emissions in New York City. And we have pretty much the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction mandate in the world, right? Could you talk a little bit about, just dive further into why New York City decided to have the most aggressive standard for existing buildings anywhere in the world, as opposed to, what California is doing around, new buildings and trying to get mandates around new buildings versus existing buildings?
Well, I think a big chunk of it is that earlier reason of, all these buildings already exist. And so, yes, we need to upgrade new construction standards, and that's going to help to make sure that we're not locking in longer term problems with new buildings. The existing buildings are a major problem. And even once you dive into that, 68 or so % of cities' greenhouse gas emissions coming from buildings, it's disproportionately from some of the biggest and most polluting buildings. And that's what those local laws are really targeting. And I think it gets to the heart of the matter of, we need to end the age of fossil fuels. We need to transition ourselves away from fossil fuels. And we're doing that in a lot of different ways in New York City. It's, leading by example on our own buildings, our own fleet, taking those out through different regulations or local laws to the private market to make sure private buildings are as efficient as possible. We're also doing things like the mayor has been very clear on his opposition to any new expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in New York City, which has culminated in the opposition to things like the Williams Pipeline, the North Brooklyn Pipeline just recently, and also how we're using our financial might as a city. And we're working to divest our pension funds from fossil fuels and shift and invest much more heavily into climate solutions to the tune of billions of dollars, leveraging the strength of our pension funds. And so I think it all starts from a sort of the values point of we need as a city to set a global example for how we're going to end the age of fossil fuels. And we need to do that with our own actions. We need to do that with our financing, and we need to do that with our codes and standards and bring that out to the marketplace. And when you do that in a place like New York City, the media capital of the world, the cultural capital of the world, the financial capital of the world, it ripples across the globe and has such a bigger impact, because when we do things here, people notice. Even funnily enough, we may not always be the first city to do something, but just because of our media presence, a lot of times people just think it is the first place it happened just because that's the first place they've heard about it. I think we take that seriously, that we are on that world stage, and we need to lead by example, and we need to project that out to the rest of the world.
I hope that many more mayors and city halls across the country demonstrate the political courage that the city of New York has to really pass aggressive legislation to reduce fossil fuels in buildings. Tough thing to do. You guys pulled it off here in New York, and a lot of us are really proud of you guys for that. So with regard to like OneNYC, how's the implementation of the OneNYC climate plan been impacted by the pandemic? Could you talk a little bit more? Have you seen the kind of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from office buildings in Manhattan because people are working remotely that you expected? Have you seen reductions in transportation and commuting that you would have expected? Kind of where are we with regard to expectations, and how has the pandemic either accelerated or decelerated parts of the implementation of the OneNYC plan?
Yeah, so there are some natural things that, like, there's been some press on this recently that certain programs, I think most notably as organics, have been there's been some budget cuts temporarily to that program, and that's just the natural, I think, cycle of being in this moment. It's going to come back, and we should all be confident it's going to come back. But a lot of other things, of course, are still moving very much ahead, and and the things like the implementation of existing legislation and those initiatives very much on track moving forward. The work to divest our pension funds very much on track and moving forward. We're going to hit those targets.
Oh, awesome.
I think, and in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, there's still far too much fluctuation year to year. That's like, it feels driven by the weather at this point. Certain years where we have more heating days and cooling days, we're going to see more greenhouse gas emissions. What's, I think, more important here is that we're locking in the policy to really bend those curves, and something like Local Law 97, as those requirements come into effect in 2024 and 2030, we're going to see a big ramp up in the kind of retrofit work that's necessary, that is putting ourselves on that track to achieve the 40% reduction by 2030, the 80% reduction by 2050, and ultimately achieving carbon neutrality as a city. The policy is really important to move past this moment where it still fluctuates a little too much based on some of the weather conditions and other economic growth and things like that have happened in the last couple of years. And so I would definitely always point people to think through and focus on the long-ranging policy, things like building retrofits, the things continued investments in electric vehicles and those initiatives that are really going to, I think, change that pattern over the next several years.
Cool. I wanted to ask a little bit about the carbon challenge. It'd be great if you could walk us through that. I mean, we know it's a public-private partnership. There's more than 100 different institutions, some private companies, some civic, public organizations, nonprofits, Bloomberg, Google, Etsy, lots of our tech leaders here in New York City are part of this carbon challenge. Warby Parker. How are you guys working with the business community and the tech community in particular to drive carbon reductions in New York City, given the unique relationship that the city has with tech giants?
Well, I think that the carbon challenges have been fantastic over the last several years. This goes back almost a decade at this point, I think, of partnering with big institutions, big real estate owners, companies across the city to set higher than required targets for carbon emissions. And we've seen a lot of those institutions come back, meet those targets and want to accelerate and even take it beyond their initial commitments. And there was some, there were some programs on zero waste commitments as well that people were making. I think it shows the level of interest from the wider civic community to be part of these solutions, and I think that gives us a lot of hope that there's more, I think, latent interest in being part of these kind of solutions, helping to drive ourselves away from fossil fuels. And when we have the kind of institutions and companies and tech companies that are willing to step up and go above and beyond, it sends a great message out to the rest of the community that, these things are achievable. This isn't just, pie in the sky. These aren't impossible. The technology exists. It's financeable. It makes business sense, but you have to be willing to do it. And I think demonstrating the political will from the city side and, the leadership from the partnerships we have with the private sector or the universities or real estate owners only continues to send that message out to the wider world that this is something that, not only do we have to do it, it's achievable, we can do it, and we're moving forward on it already.
I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball here. So I talked to a bunch of some billionaire real estate families as well as large real estate companies who privately are quite clear that they're believers in climate change. They know that the city of New York has to continue to lead the way to reduce greenhouse gases, yet publicly they raise lots of questions around the methodology or cost of some of the implementation of OneNYC, whether it's in real estate or avoiding the next superstorms, flooding the city. How are we going to implement these things? And one of the things they often point back to is, well, we want to see the city lead by example. How are you guys leading by example in city-owned buildings, schools, public housing, city-owned office buildings? What kind of case studies are you guys creating as you address the infrastructure and buildings that you guys control as the city of New York?
Yeah, it is fundamental to how we're approaching this that we know we need to lead by example. And so, Local Law 97 is not the thing we're just putting on, the private marketplace. We're investing billions of dollars into municipal buildings, putting, solar on roofs, retrofitting NYCHA complexes, all the work that is about leading by example. We're doing the same thing with vehicles. We're on, I think we have thousands of electric vehicles in our fleet at this point on the city streets and growing, and that's going to be expanded to all the city vehicles. And then at the same time, continue to invest in the charging infrastructure and the other methods of getting that, getting electric vehicles out into more fleets around the city as well. So I think, leading by example is just part of how we know we have to do this. It's partly putting our money where our mouth is, of course, but it's also the right thing to do to make sure we're heading towards, the right targets as a city. And we're doing that with our energy as well. And we've got targets to be 100% clean electricity over the next 5 years. And we're working to ramp up solar, support the offshore wind industry as it's burgeoning and going to continue to grow in New York City, investing in hydro and bringing that directly into New York City as another clean electricity source. So we are trying to find out every single way we can use our purchasing power, our procurement, our own, all the tools we have in our own toolbox. But it can't just stop with what we do as a city government. We do need to find ways to bring that out into the wider marketplace. And if people are, if there's private griping or something about that around how that plays out, I'm sure there are plenty of companies and others that would want to see more incentives or more grants for that. But that's the natural sort of negotiating process that happens. It's not going to stop us from moving forward with really aggressive legislation wherever we need to in order to make sure that we're on track to being a carbon neutral city by 2050.
And everybody wants it, public griping aside, And it wouldn't be New York City if there wasn't a little griping. That's how it goes.
Here we are.
It's who we are. Two or three more quick questions. The Hydro-Quebec, hydroelectric project is a really, really important and fascinating and complex and awesome and amazing, again, public-private partnership that the city of New York is leading in order to bring clean hydroelectric power to the city of New York. Walk us through how you're thinking about that. And then after we talk about that, I want to spend a couple minutes on the role of tech, big tech and emerging startups, and what we can do to support the city of New York as you lead us on this. So first, hydro. And if you don't mind, how you're thinking about, hydroelectric power and potentially the role of carbon offsets as part of that hydroelectric power plant.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, the mayor in April 2019 made a commitment that we're going to have 100% clean electricity across the entire city by 2040. And that, again, we're going to lead by example. We want the city government over the next several years to get itself to be 100% clean as well. And one of the ways in which we're doing that and proceeding to accomplish that is with importing Canadian hydropower directly into New York City. Now, you got to understand a few things about our sort of electric grid here. There's a lot of clean electricity upstate. A lot of that doesn't get down into New York City. There's transmission bottlenecks. There's a number of other challenges here that we still have a lot of fossil generation here in New York City. And, those come on and they cause air quality concerns, environmental injustice in certain communities. It's a real challenge. And one of the benefits of bringing hydropower directly into New York City, alongside the commitments to solar and energy efficiency and offshore wind, of course, is that we can connect directly into New York City. We can bridge some of those transmission bottlenecks. And by bringing clean electricity right into the city, we can start to shut down the most dirty, polluting, air pollution causing peakers and other generation we have in the city, which pollutes in communities of color and poorer communities across the city and just causes a tremendous environmental injustice. And we can begin to get past that. Now we're also, we're also digging ourselves out of the closure of Indian Point, which is, taking clean electricity off the grid for many reasons, of course, but it's just the fact that it's going to close and we need to find ways to fill that with clean electricity, and hydro is a great way to do that. And it provides the baseload power that New York City needs and can help us get to a point of securing 100% clean electricity for municipal uses over the next several years. So, we've had, I think, some really great progress there with our partnership with NYSERDA on this, and they're continuing to move forward the Tier 4 REC process, which is providing renewable energy credits for renewable power that can connect directly into New York City. So I think we're on a really good path with this project, and it's one piece of the entire puzzle that we need to get to 100% clean electricity for the entire city by 2040. And a big part of that is also going to be, of course, the offshore wind that we're continuing to see grow here in New York City as well.
Yeah, and I'm a member of the board of the Sierra Club Foundation, and I'm just incredibly excited about the hydroelectric power plant. I think it really reflects the kind of values and direction for New York City and all cities across the country that we need to pursue. I think it's a brilliant policy. So my last two questions before we move into questions from the audience is how can the big tech companies in New York City support New York City's leadership in reducing and mitigating the impacts of climate change in New York across the country? You spoke a little bit about that, but is there more that they can do? And then second, how can emerging startups help out? Are there particular problems or data sets or kinds of analyses that would be helpful for you for somebody listening to start a new company to help you resolve?
Now, I'm sure if I had some of those ideas, I'd probably be starting those companies. So I think the best thing, I would probably answer that in terms of, the kind of information we have access to. And, we are very open to soliciting ideas on how people want to best use that information and think about how to support, clean tech and clean energy here in New York City. And I think about the sort of information we put out on open data and the work we're doing on environmental justice and publishing information about all the different impacts we're having across the city on air quality concerns and flooding impacts and other things, I can only imagine that there is so much opportunity out there for business opportunities to leverage that data to help support the city by aligning, what's happening out in the private marketplace with the goals that we're setting as a city and as a government for, ending the age of fossil fuels, getting ourselves to be carbon neutral. And that's requiring a whole range of technology and investment around solar and building retrofits and energy efficiency and, the connections and the electric grid upgrades for distributed generation. I just think there continues to be so many opportunities to align companies and business models with those targets and to leverage all the data that we put out on places like Open Data in order to find the opportunities and to really help support that effort. So those aren't, I'm by no means going to be the person that's going to tell you, here's the business model that I think is going to make you $1 billion. I think people listening in on this are probably going to be a whole lot smarter in finding those opportunities. But what we can do is set the policy landscape for where we need to go as a city and unleash the innovation in the private sector to help us achieve those goals and to help support the economic development in the clean tech community here in New York City.
Awesome. Tyler, any questions that you have or questions that are coming in from the audience?
Yeah, so let's open this up. Would love for folks to just unmute themselves and jump in here if you have a question that you'd like to ask either Dan or Donnel. Donnel himself is the founder of a tech startup that is very much in this space, and we should all feel free to grill him as much as we're grilling Dan for the next 20 minutes. But if you don't want to unmute yourself, feel free to drop a question in the chat box as well, and we can review and call those out there. But maybe I'll start while people get some questions teed up. You're just talking about how, the startup or the technology ecosystem in New York can leverage some of the data that the city has to sort of build tools that can be helpful back to the city. But I also wanted to ask about the other way around. There's a lot of data or information that startups and technology companies have that could be useful to the city. We want to facilitate an environment where there's more sharing of that. And so I guess my question is what data or insights do you not have currently at the city or via the open data laws that you wish you did have that could be helpful, for the next year of OneNYC for a post-pandemic strategy readjustment on some of our, some of the priorities?
I think as part of it is not knowing what we don't know. And I've seen some really interesting data that comes out of private data sets, things like cell phone data and, for transportation and mobility planning and a lot of things like that become really interesting. And I know in this pandemic moment, the city launched I forget the exact name, but it was basically a data partnership for recovery planning with a number of companies that were willing to share that sort of private sector data with the city and partner on how to best use it. And I think I would channel it into efforts like that and working with our mayor's office of data analytics and the leadership there to really help support the connection between private sector and data and what the government needs. And I think there's a really effective platform being built there for exactly this kind of conversation.
Right. Great. There is a conversation in the chat here. I'll just, everyone can probably read it, but I'll also just call it out as well. A question about embodied carbon in the built environment. There's a pending bill in the legislature at the state level and a number of opportunities around that. Just want to get your take and point of view on that, Dan.
It's really important questions. And, I think I've seen just recently that, globally, the production of cement is 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And, finding ways to decarbonize how we build means going deep into the value chain of construction to figure out all the different, embodied energy that goes into our, construction and buildings and infrastructure. And there's a really interesting partnership that we've just started paying attention to that C40 Cities, one of the important partners that we have, has been launching. And I think the city of Oslo has been really leading on this of I think they call their clean construction standards. I think we have a lot of work to figure out how that actually applies here in New York City and what it would mean to, move legislation like that. But I think the underlying idea of it is incredibly important, because if we can decarbonize how we build, it makes it just easier to achieve our targets, get greenhouse gas emissions out of, how we build buildings and infrastructure. So I think it's all something that we need to find a way to get to yes on. And I'm sure the specifics of it, we're going to have to, haggle over and figure out and make sure we do right. But there are some really interesting global models out there that we've already been paying attention to.
Yeah, maybe I'll also get Donnel's take on that a little bit as well, from the perspective of someone who's running an organization that's actually like executing and implementing a lot of the projects, along those lines.
Then perspective on what? We're implementing lots of projects using data from the city, in the city of New York and in the metro area, but with regard to what else?
I mean, I think just in regards to the policy environment, like how this particular bill and the legislature that we're talking about now, but also just sort of how, you're interacting with, policy institutions and offices like Dan's office, and sort of doing that from the actual development side.
Yeah. I mean, I think the concrete bill is really interesting. One of my friends is the CEO and founder of one of the tech companies that has a green concrete solution that he's offering. And so, we helped him talk to some people in the state assembly about the bill, and, hopefully it'll move forward. Lots of municipalities are moving forward with green concrete, which I think is really important, particularly in New York City, where construction is such a huge part of what we do. I think it's great to be in a city where we have the most aggressive, frankly, and not just because Dan is here that I'm saying this, we have the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction mandate in the entire world for buildings right here in New York City. And as Dan mentioned, we have, one of the media capitals around the globe. If we can get things right here first, quickly, create the new technologies, create the new data sets, create the new financial information on payback and payoff for retrofits, and aggressively attack, the greenhouse gas emissions, 60-70% of which are from our buildings. And we can demonstrate to cities across the world how you reduce fossil fuel usage in buildings at scale, and we innovate and develop those set of practices in New York City. I think that's incredible. So having that hyper aggressive foundation as policy in New York City is just like a giant, positive platform for any startup or company to operate on as the baseline of a set of market transactions. So that's one. And then I think, frankly, Governor Cuomo and the state legislature's leadership to pass statewide Green New Deal legislation, right, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions across the entire economy. We have hyper aggressive legislation in New York City due to the leadership of Dan and Mayor de Blasio and Mark and their teams. And then we have super aggressive legislation at the state level. This gives us a really unique opportunity as business leaders in New York City and New York State to really demonstrate to other cities and other states and to the Biden-Harris administration how to get things done in terms of smart, green, distributed infrastructure. And it's a massive opportunity for us to become leaders in installing, financing, building software and machine learning and predictive analytics for smart green infrastructure across the globe. How can New York City lead the way in that new emerging tech industry? And so it's a really great gift to us as private sector actors to have that clear, aggressive policy framework and the opportunity to become a market leader globally.
Great. Yeah. I see Will Fisher has his hand up, so I'm going to jump over to him.
Will, my man.
Hey, Donnel. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Will.
Tyler. Good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to, I think in regard to Donnel, what you were just saying, and also a question for Dan, like in a framework where it's possible to compel, these sort of very large buildings owned by big companies with sort of the deep enough pockets to make these kinds of retrofits and improvements, in a world where that's sort of, definitely the low-hanging fruit and sort of the easiest first step. I think would love to hear sort of strategies on, one, how to get folks to become interested in paying for it, but two, just sort of how to get on the radar of like small mom and pop, either homeowners or landlords, you know, with sort of the hundreds of thousands of structures that are just, you know, a lot smaller and sort of don't fit into a model where you can compel them to do something necessarily, but like, you know, in a world where there is a bunch of other sort of competing priorities, including, you know, those folks' bottom lines, like how can you connect small individual folks who don't necessarily have like building science expertise or financing expertise, but, you know, they're just renting out a room. Like how can we include sort of that scale and roll it out to that volume of people?
Let me take a swing on this, Dan, because the city of New York had the foresight to anticipate your question, Will, and we actually worked with the city on a pilot project to explore just that, right? How do you bring the benefits of sustainability in buildings to small, you know, brownstones owned by mom and pop, small townhouses, small single family homes, you know, basement apartments out there in East New York or Queens? How do we make sure that they benefit from the benefits of sustainability? And so we worked with the city of New York to figure out how to green 500 or 600 small and medium-sized buildings owned by mom and pop New Yorkers. You know, lots of families who moved to New York, Brooklyn, Queens in the 70s, early 80s. They bought the brownstones when they were cheap. You know, 2 generations later, their grandkids live in the brownstone with them. They have tenants who are like their extended family because they've been living together in this address for 30 years, and they don't want to raise rents. They don't want to sell the building. And so you can talk to them about how to reduce their annual energy costs, right? Well, you got an expensive oil boiler that's about to go kaput in your basement. Why don't we hook you up with some new all-electric heating system from Japan that's top of the line? It's going to make your building more profitable. It's going to make your building 11 to 12% more valuable. It's going to create local jobs for local contractors who we've trained to install these systems. It's going to make your building healthier because now you're not burning oil or gas in your basement and spreading particles and air pollution throughout your building. Now you got clean electricity that's powering your building. Maybe you throw some solar panels up on the roof, which we've done at a few buildings in Brooklyn. Now the whole building's all electric. Maybe you switch out your hot water system so that's all electric too. Now your building's more profitable, more valuable, it's healthier, and you haven't had to raise rents. That's a compelling value proposition, particularly for a building owner who's going to have to spend $50,000 to change their boiler anyway. How can they think about working with HPD and affordable housing departments in the city of New York, or the mayor's office of sustainability, or NYSERDA at the state level to make that transition to clean energy? We think it's really exciting that New Yorkers are leading the way on this. And I think we're going to create a really massive new green buildings industry focused on small and medium-sized apartment buildings in Upper Manhattan, in the outer boroughs, in the Lower East Side, as well as the 200-unit luxury condos on the Upper West Side and Upper East Side. Those smaller buildings are going to require specific expertise from contractors. How do we use smart construction and prop tech advances so that when we send a construction worker out to one of these 4-unit buildings in Queens, they've got all the data they need on their smartphone. They've got a digital 3-dimensional image of that building before they get to the site. They know exactly what smart green equipment needs to go into that building. They've been trained on how to properly install it. And if they have a question, there's an app on their phone that helps them use, visual recognition technology to complete the project successfully. So these are the kinds of things that we're working on in New York City that we think are going to help other cities across the state and across the country to serve, the 5 million buildings that meet the criteria that you just outlined, Will.
Yeah, and how powerful to have those programs in place, the financing, the incentives, things like PACE financing, at exactly this moment when our economy needs those jobs to accelerate ourselves out of this economic crisis from the pandemic. So powerful to be able to really show what a Green New Deal looks like and what job creation or climate really, and the benefits it can bring. What a great way to talk about that as like fixing not only economic challenges of a building, the health challenges of a building, and do that in a way that creates those kind of jobs in this moment. It's really it's a great distillation of how we're trying to approach things in New York City, and we've got the platform for it built already.
That's great. So the incentives are there. It's just now it's time for the uptake. That's good to hear.
Yeah, I think so. As a private sector participant, I think the city and state have done everything they need to do to facilitate these transactions. Now it's up to us as private sector participants, New York City civic leaders, locally elected officials to implement this. Like the city and state have done largely what they need to do to get us off to a strong start. That is my view. Yep. I mean, don't quit your job, Dan, but still more work to do. But I do think they've gotten us off to a strong start.
And a lot of people are really talking about like what it takes to continue to up our ambitions on smaller buildings and how to make that work and the financing and other things to make that work. So you're going to see more. There's definitely going to be more of this conversation over the next months and years as we continue to find ways to increase our ambition because it's necessary. We've I love hearing Donnel say that we've done everything we have to do. We still have a lot more to do.
Sorry, I was muted. There's another question here in the chat I want to bring up. It's a question about biodiversity approaches and how things like reducing the temperature in streets, creating more healthier living. How do those sorts of measures come into play here, Dan?
Oh, it's a great question because and it's something that was core to our values for OneNYC is really thinking about, the urban forest and street trees and how they can contribute to, yes, biodiversity goals. It can contribute to urban heat mitigation, can contribute to resilience, things like continuing to install oyster beds, off our coastline for storm mitigation and wave attenuation. So I think there's, everywhere we can, we're trying to figure out how nature can be part of this solution, and I think about it also in terms of what our Department of Environmental Protection is doing for stormwater management. Well, instead of continuing to install the gray infrastructure and just more pipes, the award-winning Blue Belt system in Staten Island, or the 6,000 or so bioswales that we're building across the city to divert more rainwater out of our combined sewer system, which cleans up our harbor, helps protect the wastewater treatment system. Like just so many benefits that come from leveraging nature as part of the solution here. And it's biodiversity benefits, water quality benefits, air quality benefits, heat mitigation, all of it. And I think we find that we do that at a much more cost-effective manner when we can find those benefits.
Great. And any other questions from folks on the call here? I will just ask one quickly, here's one that just popped up. What's New York City's position on ending new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure?
Yeah, so the mayor last February, right before all of the the world changed on us, but at the State of the City last year, announced and signed a new executive order setting the city's position as opposed to the expansion of new fossil fuel infrastructure that serves the city, things like pipelines, generation, and that has played out a couple different ways over the last year, coming out in opposition and helping to stop the Williams pipeline that was coming into New York City and now is not. Just last week, the mayor announced his opposition to the North Brooklyn pipeline. And I think I saw something in the chat box about the permits. I know that's been an open question. The permits that we're talking about are sort of the ministerial street permits that I don't think are practical to pull, but what we're doing is using our voice to demonstrate that the city is opposed to these kind of projects and calling on National Grid to withdraw the project and come back with, what we need to see is more investment into renewable energy, more investment into fossil fuel infrastructure, because we know that's just going to continue to lock in more greenhouse gas emissions, more climate destruction, and we're calling for a new way to think about these the investments we need to make in order to provide the services that we need, whether it's the electricity, the heating. We need all those things. We need to do it in a different way, and we know the technology allows for it. And so we need to begin shifting that. And by setting a new policy in opposition to those kind of projects, I think it's sending a major signal here in the city, but also around the world, that we need to we need a massive transition away from fossil fuels. And this is how we do it. This is how we're starting it.
Yeah, and I think National Grid, I had a call with some of their folks up in Massachusetts where they're totally focused on heat pumps and electrification and really driving a building electrification policy in Massachusetts. And if you look at what they're doing in the United Kingdom, where they're headquartered, I think they committed to like 600,000 buildings being removed from fossil fuels and shifting to all electricity. But when you come to Brooklyn, my home borough, they're pushing these like large fossil fuel infrastructure projects. We need them to be consistent. We need them to invest in the future. National Grid needs to be compelled to do the right thing here. And I think the mayor and the city and the governor have spoken up. And I think we as the tech community need to continue to apply pressure to say we do not want Brooklyn to have more fossil fuel gas infrastructure. It's almost 2021. We don't need it. And I think the tech community can weigh in here and really demonstrate to National Grid that there's an opportunity for them to be consistent and that they can make some money. They can invest in the new distributed smart green infrastructure that we'll be installing over Brooklyn. Like they can get some tax credits. They can make some money off of this stuff as well.
Great. Maybe I'll ask just, we're close to being out of time here, so maybe I'll ask one last question. Dan, on OneNYC 2050, 2050 feels like a long time away, but it's not really. Between, the plan being sort of established and relaunched in early 2019 and 2050, I want to ask you a question about how you're measuring progress in between. Like what sorts of goalposts do you have in place to ensure that we are going to get to where we want to be when 2050 does arrive?
Yeah, it's a great question because, you could do these strategic planning processes and set targets for the next several decades. And, the political calendar means that we won't be here when those deadlines are out there. And so we needed to think about a different way for accountability for such long-term targets. And I think we are really blessed as a city. It's funny to say it that way, but to have the structure in place for regular long-term planning as a city. Since 2007, when the initial Plan YC was released. Now, there's legislation that requires every 4 years, the city needs to assess the threats that face us. We need to think about our population growth and our infrastructure and all the challenges. And we've expanded that in the de Blasio administration for issues of equity and, health and wealth inequities in the city, issues of our, strengthening our democracy. And really, so every 4 years, we have to assess those threats and we have to put forward, action plans, initiatives for how we're going to address those threats. And we may be setting decadal-long goals, but we also lay out, the action plans for who's going to do what by when over the next several years. And we set very clear milestones every year that we are working to achieve. That means that we're on the path to delivering on that. And every year we publish a progress report. So you can go and look at both the milestone progress that we've established, the progress on the long-term initiatives, as well as the metrics and indicators that we've set. And we publish all of that, and it's all on open data, and you can take a look at how we're doing. And it's a way of holding ourselves accountable and putting that information out publicly so that we know that the things we're doing in the near term are keeping us on track for delivering on the long-term goals. And then every 4 years, we reassess that. And, are there new threats? Has the threat landscape changed on us in some way? Should we be pointing ourselves in a slightly different direction? And, that's going to continue. And so in 2023 will be the next time. And of course, it'll be a next mayor thinking about these challenges at that point. But we want to hand off, the tools and the budgets and the progress in order to help that next mayor succeed. And rethink all the challenges and do whatever it is they're going to do. But it locks in place this every 4 years. There's a reassessment and a restatement of the strategic plan. Every year we have accountability measures and a progress report. And that cycle is now embedded into how we operate as a city. And I think it's really powerful. And most cities don't have that sort of structure in place.
Great, thanks. Yeah. So I think we're just about out of time here. So want to thank Dan and Donnel for their time. We are going to, this video, as I said at the beginning of the call, we're recording it, so it'll be available and we'll make sure folks have access to it following the discussion. Also just want to flag for everyone on the call that if you received the details to even log on to this Zoom today, that means that you have my contact information. And Tech NYC is always here to help folks get connected to the other folks in the ecosystem and to folks in Dan's office. If you think you can be helpful, if you want to be helpful, if you have ideas you think would be helpful, we'd love to help facilitate that at Tech NYC. And then everyone just stay tuned. We will relaunch a sort of new season of these conversations in 2021. We look forward to continuing that conversation. We might check in with you guys again next year and see what's changed or hasn't changed on this front. And thanks everyone, for joining.
Thanks so much.
Thanks everybody. Everybody take care. Be safe. Thanks, Dan.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.